Captain Mira Lane stood at the helm of the Luma Star, her fingers brushing against the sleek control panel as the vast expanse of space stretched out before her. The ship drifted silently, almost eerily, through the empty void of Sector X9, A, region of the galaxy that had long been avoided by even the bravest of explorers. The sector was notorious for its strange anomalies, unexplained disappearances, and the overwhelming sense of unease that crept into the hearts of anyone who dared venture close. No one had ever returned from this area of space, and those who had tried to investigate had simply vanished without a trace. Mira's mission was simple: explore the unknown, gather data, and return home safely. She had heard the stories, of course, about X9, but she had always dismissed them as spacefaring rumors, the kind that grew in the telling. Mira had been in command of the Luma Star for nearly 5 years, and this was far from her first mission. She had charted dangerous asteroid fields, navigated through unstable nebulae, and even visited the fringes of black holes. But something about X9 was different. Something about it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Her crew, a small but seasoned team of explorers, could feel it too. As they ventured deeper into the sector, the atmosphere on the ship grew heavier, more tense. Gyro, the comms officer, seemed especially jumpy. He had been monitoring the ship's systems, checking for any signs of interference, when suddenly his voice broke the stillness. "Captain," he said, his tone more serious than Mira had ever heard it. "You need to hear this." Mira turned, frowning. "What is it, Gyro?" He turned from his station, his face pale, his eyes wide with something resembling fear. "We just picked up a distress signal. It's strange. Old. Really old." Mira walked over to his station, peering at the flashing display. The signal was faint, crackling with static, but there was no mistaking its origin, deep within the heart of Sector X9. The coordinates matched a section of space that had been long deemed uninhabitable. No known ship or station was anywhere near that location. Mira felt a chill creep up her spine. The sound of the distress signal echoed through the bridge, a deep, garbled voice that sent an unsettling feeling through her chest. "Play it again," Mira instructed, her voice steady, but she could feel her pulse quickening. Gyro hesitated for a moment before complying. The signal played again, and this time, it was clearer, though still fragmented. The voice, deep and distorted, rasped out the same words, repeating over and over like a broken record. "Help! Us! Before it wakes!" Mira's eyes narrowed. There was something inherently wrong about the message. It wasn't just the static interference that made it sound ominous. The words, though simple, carried an unmistakable urgency, a fear that echoed through the very fabric of the ship's systems. Her mind raced. Who could be sending this message? No ships were known to be in the area. There was nothing that should have been alive out here in this forsaken part of space. "Where is it coming from?" Mira asked, her voice calm, but she could feel her thoughts racing. Gyro tapped a few keys, pulling up the coordinates. His hands shook as he read the data aloud. "It's coming from the dead center of Sector X9, Captain." Mira's gaze moved to the large view screen, where the black expanse of Sector X9 stretched out before them, vast and foreboding. It was unlike any other part of space she had ever seen. The stars seemed dimmer here, as if they were being swallowed by the darkness itself. The silence was deafening, and the stillness of the void seemed to press against the ship from all sides. The Luma Star had entered uncharted territory, and as the distress signal echoed in their ears, Mira couldn't help but feel the weight of that reality. The crew was still silent, absorbing the gravity of the situation. Mira's mind whirled as she considered their options. The distress signal was not to be ignored. A part of her, perhaps the part that had always been a thrill-seeker, a pioneer, wanted to press forward, to investigate, to uncover the mystery of what lay beyond. But another part of her, the part that knew the stories about Sector X9, urged caution. Every explorer who had ventured into the heart of this region had never returned. What if this was the same? What if they were walking straight into a trap, one set by forces far beyond their understanding? And yet, her instincts as a captain kicked in. She couldn't just leave a distress signal unanswered. The lives of whoever was sending it might depend on their response. With a deep breath, Mira made her decision. "We're going in," she said firmly, turning to her crew. "Prepare for the jump. Get ready to engage at full speed. We're not turning back." There was a brief moment of hesitation, but then, one by one, her crew members nodded, understanding the gravity of the decision. Kaylin, the ship's engineer, double-checked the power systems. Rook, the tactical officer, began scanning the surrounding space for any potential threats. The rest of the crew settled into their stations, all eyes fixed on the view ahead. The Luma star slowly turned its course, heading deeper into the heart of X9. Mira's eyes remained focused on the view screen as the ship entered the darkness. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. It was as if the very fabric of space around them was holding its breath. And then, without warning, the ship's systems began to flicker. The lights dimmed. Gravity seemed to shift, subtly at first, as if the universe itself was bending, stretching, just out of their reach. Mira's hand instinctively gripped the armrest of her chair as she steadied herself. Kaylin shot her a worried look, but said nothing. Rook's scanners buzzed with strange readings, his face growing tense. Something wasn't right. And then, in the midst of the eerie silence, it happened. The ship's AI system, a highly advanced, yet somewhat mysterious entity, began to speak in a low, distorted tone. "Captain, did you hear it?" The voice of the AI was unsettling, full of distortion and static. It had never spoken like this before. "Did I hear what?" Mira asked, though she already knew. "Don't look behind you," the AI intoned, its voice a low hum that sent shivers down Mira's spine. A cold sweat broke out on her brow as she turned to the crew. They looked just as shaken as she felt. Something had awoken, and they were at the heart of it. As the distress signal continued to repeat, Mira's thoughts raced. But one thing was clear. They had ventured into a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. And whatever was waiting for them, it was not something they could escape easily. The Luma star drifted further into the depths of Sector X9, its engines humming quietly as the vast, dark expanse of space stretched out before it. Mira Lane, the ship's captain, stood at the helm, her eyes fixed on the view screen ahead. The deeper they went into this mysterious region, the heavier the air felt inside the ship. The usual hum of the ship's systems was subdued, almost as though the ship itself was hesitant, reluctant to travel further into the unknown. The crew had grown quieter as well. Tension hung thick in the air. Gyro, the communications officer, kept checking the signal, his hands shaking as he worked. Kaylin, the engineer, had taken extra precautions, securing every system and rerouting power to ensure they would have enough energy if things went wrong. Mira could feel her own heartbeat quicken with each passing moment, but she kept her gaze, steady on the star-filled void ahead, determined to lead her crew through whatever came next. As the minutes stretched into hours, nothing changed. The ship sailed through empty space, with nothing but the endless black around them. But then, a strange shift occurred. The lights on the ship flickered briefly, dimming before returning to full brightness. Mira glanced at her crew, and they exchanged uneasy looks, as though they too could sense that something was beginning to stir in the darkness. Suddenly, the ship's artificial intelligence, usually a calm and efficient presence, flared to life with a garbled, unsettling voice that echoed through the bridge. "Captain," the AI said, its voice strained. "Something is wrong. Something is coming." Mira stiffened, her mind racing. She had known that venturing further into Sector X9 would not be without risks, but this was different. It wasn't just the eerie silence, the strange atmosphere, or even the distress signal that had led them here. Now something else was happening. It was as if the very fabric of space was reacting to their presence, shifting and warping in ways that defied all logic. "What do you mean?" Mira asked, her voice steady despite the growing sense of dread. The AI's voice trembled. "The space around us. It is not like anything recorded in our charts. There is a disturbance, a pulse of energy. It is alive." Mira turned to look at Rook, the tactical officer, who was already checking his scanners. He frowned, his brow furrowing in concentration. "I'm reading something on the edge of our sensors," he said, his voice low. "It's faint, but it's there. It doesn't match any known signature, and it's coming from ahead. The signal. Captain. It's no longer just a message. It's a beacon." Mira's heart skipped a beat. The distress signal had been a warning, but now it was something else. A call, perhaps, drawing them closer. There was no turning back. She gave a tight nod, motioning for Rook to keep scanning. "Keep your eyes on it. Everyone, prepare for anything." The crew braced themselves as the ship continued its slow journey toward the source of the signal. The air felt heavier now, more oppressive. The walls of the bridge seemed to close in as the ship edged closer to the epicenter of the disturbance. Mira watched as Rook adjusted the settings on his console, trying to get a clearer picture of what lay ahead. The unknown was closing in on them, and there was no escaping it now. The ship groaned beneath them, as though it too was uneasy about what was to come. Then, out of the silence, a sudden noise shattered the stillness. It was a low, reverberating hum, almost like the sound of a massive engine starting up, far beyond anything the Lumastar could produce. The entire ship shuddered in response, and Mira gripped the arms of her chair as the force of the sound rippled through the hull. Something massive was awakening, something ancient, something that had lain dormant for who knew how long. "Captain?" Gyro said, his voice a little too calm for Mira's liking. "I'm getting something new on the comms. It's not a ship, not a station. It's a structure. I can't explain it, but it's there. It's massive." Mira turned to face him, her stomach dropping. The signal had led them to this point, but now they were no longer just responding to a distress call. They were approaching something far older, far more dangerous than they had anticipated. "Give me a visual," she ordered, her voice sharp. Thigh? Screen flickered briefly before showing the object, a colossal structure floating eerily in the void. It was unlike anything Mira had ever seen. The shape was strange, not quite geometric, but not entirely organic either. It was a dark mass, its surface covered in cracks and scars, as though it had been damaged long ago and was barely holding together. It looked like an egg. No, more like a massive, cracked shell, floating in the emptiness of space. But it wasn't just its size or shape that was unsettling. It felt alive, like it was breathing, like it was waiting for something. Mira couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen. She felt a strange pull, a compulsion to draw closer to it, even as her instinct screamed at her to turn the ship around and flee. But there was no turning back. The distress signal had led them here, and now it was their responsibility to find out why. The crew fell silent as they stared at the structure, unsure of what to do next. Mira took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She knew she had to make a decision, and fast. There was no telling what kind of danger they were facing, but there was one thing she was certain of. Whatever it was, they had to understand it, before it was too late. "Slow approach," she said firmly, her voice unwavering despite the rising tension in her chest. "Get us closer, but stay on alert. We don't know what we're dealing with yet." The crew nodded, their expressions grim. The Lumastar inched forward, the ship's engines humming softly as it crept closer to the enigmatic structure. As they drew nearer, the air in the ship seemed to grow even more oppressive, as though the very presence of the object was pushing against them, forcing them to submit to its will. Then, without warning, the structure began to change. It wasn't a sudden shift, but more like a subtle movement, a slow expansion that seemed to ripple through its surface. Mira's eyes widened as she saw what had once been cracks in the dark shell begin to widen, as though something within was stretching, awakening from a long slumber. "Something's happening," Kaylin murmured from her station. "The ship's systems are reacting to it. We're losing power in some sections. If this continues, we could—" But before she could finish, the lights on the ship flickered again, and the comm system crackled to life, cutting through the tension with a strange, unsettling voice. The same voice that had spoken the distress. "Signal. Too late. It has awoken." The word sent a chill through the crew. Mira's heart raced as she realized that the entity they had come to investigate, whatever it was not just a distress call or a beacon. It was something far worse, and it had been waiting for them all along. The signal had not been a plea for help. It had been a warning. The voice on the comm system continued to echo in the ears of the Luma Star's crew, a low and haunting whisper that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the ship. "Too late. It has awoken." Mira's pulse quickened as she glanced at her crew, their faces pale and uncertain. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with a fear that no one dared speak aloud. The ship groaned as it continued its slow approach to the massive structure, but the forward motion seemed almost futile now. Whatever it was, whatever had been waiting in the darkness of this forsaken part of space, was awakening, and nothing could stop it. Mira felt a cold shiver race down her spine as the implications of that one simple message set in. They were no longer just explorers responding to a distress signal. They were intruders, and something ancient, something far beyond. Their understanding was responding to them in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The structure before them shifted again. This time, the changes were more pronounced. The cracks in the dark shell seemed to widen further, stretching across its surface like the fingers of some gigantic hand unfurling from within. The air inside the Luma Star grew even heavier, thick, with a sense of dread that pressed down on the crew. Mira stood at the helm, gripping the console as the ship vibrated beneath her feet. The crew was on edge, each member struggling to maintain their composure in the face of the unknown. Rook, the tactical officer, was working furiously at his station, trying to decipher the strange signals emanating from the structure. His brow furrowed as he adjusted the settings on his console, eyes narrowing in concentration. "It's not just a structure," Rook muttered under his breath. It's something else. It's alive, Captain. The readings they're inconsistent, but it's as though the entire structure is pulsating with energy, like a heartbeat." Mira's mind raced, struggling to make sense of what was happening. Whatever was inside that massive shell was stirring, awakening, and it was doing so in ways they couldn't predict. There was no way to know what would come next, but one thing was certain: they were no longer in control. The ship's systems, once running smoothly, were now under strain. Power levels fluctuated, and the once clear readings on their scanners were distorted, filled with static. The Luma Star seemed to be pulling them toward the structure, its course set not by human hands, but by something far more powerful. "Captain, we've lost control," Kaylin, the chief engineer, reported, her voice strained. "The engines are failing. I've rerouted as much power as I can, but it's not enough. Whatever is influencing the ship's systems, it's beyond anything we've encountered." Mira clenched her fists, her mind racing. They were trapped, stuck in a deadly dance, with a force they didn't understand, and every moment they stayed in its grip. The danger grew. She turned to Rook. "Can you track where that voice came from? Can we communicate with it?" Rook's hands moved swiftly across his console, but his eyes remained fixed on the screens, his expression grim. I can track the signal, but it's faint, almost as though it's being deliberately suppressed. The structure itself is acting like a massive barrier. I can't get a clear connection. Do we have any idea what that thing is? Mira pressed, her voice tight with urgency. I wish I knew, Captain, Rook replied. But everything in our database says it shouldn't even exist. This isn't a ship, a station, or anything we've encountered. It's something else, something ancient. The truth settled over them like a heavy fog. They were no longer dealing with a distress call. They were facing an intelligence, an entity whose origins were beyond comprehension. Mira's thoughts raced. Could this be some kind of weapon? A relic from a long-forgotten civilization? She didn't know, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, studied perhaps. The way the structure pulsed, the way it reacted to their presence, it was as if it had been waiting for them. And now that it had them, it was making its move. Suddenly, the lights flickered again. The entire ship trembled, and the faint hum that had filled the air now became a low, resonant growl. Mira's eyes widened as she turned toward the view screen. The cracks in the structure were now glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. It was as though the thing inside had finally reached the surface, pushing its way through the decaying shell. The intensity of the glow grew, brightening the dark expanse around them, casting an unnatural light over the ship. It's opening, Rook whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising noise. The structure's surface began to shift and peel apart. Massive sections of the dark shell disintegrated, revealing something beneath. It was unlike anything any of them had ever seen. The shape that emerged from within was both mesmerizing and terrifying. It was a form of liquid darkness swirling in on itself, constantly changing shape, yet undeniably intelligent. It was like looking into the abyss and seeing something stare back. The crew watched in stunned silence as the shape grew, slowly expanding outward, until it covered the view screen entirely. The ship was now completely surrounded by this darkness, and it felt as though the very air was being consumed. Captain? Gyro's voice broke through the tension, his words filled with disbelief. It's communicating. It's not speaking in words, but it's reaching out. I can feel it. The ship's systems are reacting to it. It's like it's trying to understand us. Or maybe we're the ones being understood. The air grew cold, the temperature inside the Lumastar dropping rapidly. Mira's breath came out in visible clouds as she stood frozen, staring at the screen. The entity, whatever it was, had made contact. She didn't know if it was hostile or simply curious, but the ship's systems were reacting as though they were being scanned, evaluated. It was as though their very existence was being probed, dissected. We need to get out of here, Kaylin said urgently. Whatever that thing is, it's not something we want to get any closer to. The ship can't take much more of this. Mira hesitated, her mind torn between the desire to flee and the need to understand. But just as she opened her mouth to issue the order, something unexpected happened. The creature, or entity, expanded further, covering the view screen completely. There was no longer any sight of the Lumastar's surroundings. The ship was surrounded by an impenetrable wall of dark energy. The crew tried to respond, but the ship's controls had gone completely dead. Nothing worked. The ship was no longer under their control, and the entity had them completely in its grasp. Then, without warning, the strange voice returned, louder this time, reverberating through the ship as though it came from all directions at once. It was no longer a whisper but a roar, a commanding presence that filled every inch of the Lumastar. You are not the first, it said, its voice ancient and resonant. But you are the last. Mira's heart stopped. What had they walked into? What was this entity? And why had it waited for them? Before she could gather her thoughts, the darkness seemed to close in around the ship, and the crew braced for what was coming next. They had awoken something far older, far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. And now there would be no escape. The eerie silence that followed the entity's declaration was crushing. The crew of the Lumastar felt the weight of its words settle upon them like an invisible hand pressing down on their very souls. You are not the first, but you are the last. The voice boomed through the ship's comm system, vibrating through the walls and even through their bones. It was a voice that did not belong to any known language, yet somehow it made perfect sense. Mira stood frozen at the helm, her eyes wide as the ship continued to shudder under the weight of the strange force surrounding them. She could feel the temperature inside the ship continue to plummet, the cold now so intense that it hurt to breathe. There was no escaping it now. The Lumastar had been ensnared by something ancient, and the terror that crept into Mira's heart was unlike anything she had ever known. They were no longer merely explorers responding to a distress signal. They were intruders in the domain of a cosmic intelligence that had waited for centuries, if not millennia, for someone to find it, for someone to awaken it. "Captain, what do we do?" Kaylin's voice was small, trembling with fear, yet it carried the weight of every crew member's unspoken thoughts. Mira didn't know the answer. Nothing in her training, nothing in all of human history had prepared her for this. Whatever had awakened was far beyond their understanding. It had communicated with them, or perhaps it had only allowed them to hear its voice, to feel its presence. The Lumastar had become a mere plaything for a force so powerful that it could shape the very fabric of reality. Mira could see it in the faces of her crew, their minds racing with the same thoughts she had. What was this entity? What did it mean by its cryptic words? And most haunting of all, why had it called them the Day? Last, the strange dark form surrounding them began to pulse again, its blackness intensifying with every passing second. The walls of the ship seemed to warp, and the windows, once clear, became reflections of the growing void outside. The entity was pressing closer, and Mira could feel its presence closing in, suffocating everything around them. The once distant feeling of being watched had now grown into something far more tangible. It was as if every thought, every movement was being observed by something that could see beyond mere physical space. And yet, despite the growing sense of impending doom, there was no immediate attack. No hostile force, no weapon, just a strange, unsettling quiet that settled over the crew. "Rook, can you regain control of the ship?" Mira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just a question, it was a plea. They needed to act. They needed to escape, but the ship's systems had completely failed. The engines were dead. The navigation system was a lifeless husk. The comm systems were nothing but static. The crew was trapped. Rook worked furiously at his console, his fingers flying over the controls, but it was as though the ship itself was no longer responding to him. "I can't, Captain. It's like something is blocking all of our systems. We can't move. We can't communicate. This entity, it's overriding everything." Mira's breath caught in her throat. The entity had taken full control. It had turned the Lumastar into a prison, and every passing moment felt like the walls were closing in, both physically and mentally. It was as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. The crew could only watch helplessly as the entity continued, its slow, deliberate process of enveloping them. It wasn't just a physical presence. It was a presence that stretched into their minds, touching their thoughts, their very fears. Mira could feel her mind becoming heavy, as though the weight of the entity's ancient intelligence was pressing down on her consciousness. Then, as if it had been waiting for her to reach this breaking point, the voice returned, sharper this time, cutting through the cold silence of the ship. "You fear me?" it said, the words curling around her like smoke. "But fear is not enough. It is understanding that will save you." Mira's heart raced. Understanding? How could they possibly understand? They were just a crew on a routine mission. Nothing prepared them for this. Nothing had told them that this forsaken corner of space held something so ancient, so powerful. She tried to steady her breath, to calm herself, but the pressure inside her chest only grew. The ship trembled again, and this time it wasn't from the cold or the entity's presence. It was something else. A rumble, deep within the ship's core, a vibration that spread through every deck and chamber. It was as if the ship itself were beginning to break apart, or perhaps it was being remade. The walls of the ship seemed to shift again, the floor undulating as though it were liquid. Mira stumbled, her knees buckling as she struggled to maintain her footing. "Captain!" Kaylin screamed, her voice tinged with desperation. "The walls! They're—" Before Kaylin could finish, the walls of the Luma star folded inward, warping and twisting into a shape that defied logic. The very structure of the ship seemed to dissolve, replaced by something far more organic, more alive. Mira's eyes widened in disbelief as the ship transformed before her very eyes, its sleek metal frame replaced with a pulsating dark substance that seemed to breathe. The crew members looked on in horror as the ship became a part of the very entity that had ensnared them. There was no escape. There was no going back. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Mira heard the voice again. This time, it was different. The tone was softer, almost compassionate, as though the entity were trying to soothe them. "Do you now understand?" it asked. And for the first time, there was no menace, no anger, only a deep, unsettling calm. "I am the last of my kind. I have been waiting for you, for the one who would understand the true purpose of your existence." Mira felt a chill run through her as she understood, in that single moment, the horrifying truth. The Luma star had not stumbled upon a distress signal. It had stumbled upon the remains of a civilization, one long forgotten. The entity, the dark presence that surrounded them, was all that was left. It had been waiting for someone to answer its call, waiting for the right moment to make itself known again. And now, it had found them. "You are not the first to seek answers in the darkness," the voice continued. "But you are the last who will be given the choice." Mira felt a wave of terror wash over her as the meaning of the words settled in. The entity wasn't just an observer, it was a judge. And now, it was deciding their fate. As the Luma star continued to morph and shift, as the crew members scrambled to comprehend what was happening to them, Mira realized there was no escaping it. They were the last to hear the voice, the last to understand. And as the darkness closed in, she understood the full, terrifying weight of the entity's words. The universe was not vast enough to contain the truth they had uncovered. The galaxy would never be the same again. The Luma star was not just a ship anymore. It was the final vessel, carrying the final message to a universe that would never forget what it had awakened.